Welcome to RPG Reanimators, a podcast for GMs where we dissect horror scenarios and offer our experiences and advice to reanimate them at the table. I'm Lex.
I'm Beth.
I'm Holly.
I'm Fiona.
Hi, I'm Hailey Piper.
And today we are joined by a special guest, Hailey Piper, who will be helping us consult on a serious case of how to bring in more queer horror in tabletop RPGs. Hailey is an award-winning horror author and prominent figure within the queer horror literature genre, who is well known for titles like Queen of Teeth, The Worm and His Kings trilogy, No Gods for Drowning, A Light Most Hateful, and many, many others, soon to be including her release of A Game in Yellow, which is slated for release in August 2025. Thank you so much for coming on, Hailey.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. We are also joined by Beth from the David Behavior Book Review podcast and Fiona from the What Am I Rolling podcast, in some cross-contamination between all of our areas of interest. Thank you both for being here as well. And last but not least, before we get started, we'll be discussing quite a few of Hailey's books during this discussion, and we'll try to avoid specific spoilers wherever possible. However, if we do end up mentioning some big spoilers in our discussion today, I will conduct a ritual to summon future Lex to specify them here. We generally allude to some of the bigger ticket plot events in The Worm and His Kings and Queen of Teeth, but don't give any very specific points away, and mention a few of the events earlier on in A Light Most Hateful. Besides that, you should be good to go. And now, with all of that said, let's begin this group consultation. So, Hailey, how would you like to introduce yourself and your works for general listeners in our audience?
I write short stories, novellas, and novels. My kind of four pillars of my storytelling tend to be empathy, weirdness, queerness, and awe. The last one kind of leads into where I've sort of become by accident a cosmic horror author. And yeah, my 15th and 16th books are coming out this summer.
Oh, that's right. I didn't mention Teenage Girls Can Be Demons. What was the official date on that one?
August 16th.
Oh, they're both in August. Nice.
Sorry. No, wait. I'm wrong. Sorry. September 16th.
Okay, so August and then September.
August 12th for A Game in Yellow, September 16th for Teenage Girls Can Be Demons. And that's the second time I've done that.
Okay, awesome. So before we get too deep into all of the discussion, I want to kind of open up with a general discussion about horror and then have all of us contribute to like a brainstorming for a shared definition of queer horror that we'll be using for our discussions in this episode. I personally love horror as I find it so malleable and abstract and can be defined in times more in terms of the types of feelings that they are intended or sometimes not intended to evoke in given audiences. Horror can be a lot about pushing and exploring limits and sometimes capitalizing states of discomfort while we're there as a shared form of entertainment. The limits can be our bodies, they can be social norms, senses of time, place, and self. Cosmic horror, I think, tends to do this a lot by exploring the limits of existence of humanity or its general insignificance. And sometimes horror can come from struggles for survival or against loss, and sometimes growth against monstrous odds, pun mildly intended there. So, in talking about how horror is just kind of this splattery Venn diagram, how do we want to try and come up with a definition for queer horror? This is just my research brain coming out, so I try to like operationalize terms before getting into the actual nitty gritty.
Well, I guess I'll go first. I think that there's in general generally two kinds of queer horror. One is you have a horror story and there are queer characters, there's queer representation, that kind of thing. And the other is more of a thematically queer, like queerness is part of the substance of it. And that gets to be a lot broader because I think a lot of horror ends up being on purpose or accidentally queer, just because by its nature, it tends to be a transgressive genre compared to certain other ones. And with our society being the way it is, queerness itself is considered transgressive. Just as an example, as a kid, I'd see a lot of myself in like the creature from the Black Lagoon. Just the way that it's just there in the swamp wanting to be left alone, or in the rainforest, and it's other people who come in and make a problem out of its existence.
Very relatable.
Very Shrek coded.
Shrek coded.
Everything has left my brain. I'm sorry. It's all filled with Shrek now.
Shrek has the habit of doing that.
Yeah. I guess I can have a quick go. Admittedly,
Sure.
For me, horror has always been the veil you put over things. And I haven't only recently started to think about sort of more queer horror stuff, because I think it is becoming more and more in the zeitgeist. As Hailey was saying, it's just, we're not having now, it's not, oh, by the way, queer people are in the story, but they're not necessarily the protagonist. They're the person there. And you go, oh, of course, or they are, the bury your gay trope comes up quite a lot in these horror stories as well. But then when you think of, say, I saw the TV Glow, or It's What's Inside, which are two sort of sci-fi thriller films that have sort of come out both very, very different, but they do explore themes of sexuality and obviously transgenderism. And it's just like, it's so interesting because they don't necessarily put, unless you go into sort of maybe deep critique of them, they don't necessarily put them out there as this is a queer film. It's only, you see the signs and you go, I know exactly what this film is trying to tell me. So I think more and more now we are having these films sort of come out that aren't explicitly, in my books, marketed as these queer horror films. But then, you have some things. Cuckoo is another one I watched recently. Fantastic film. And I, again, didn't know anything about it until I sort of read up a bit later. And I thought, what a great sort of way of sort of just doing all these sort of themes. And yeah, like I said, I think there's just 3 different ways of doing it. But it's just something that's really new to me, I'd say.
Yeah, I'll say, like, I'm probably the least literary person here. It's not my background. I enjoy reading. I love reading, but my background's engineering, so I tend to just approach things very technically. So in my mind, kind of coming into this discussion, I had been thinking of like queer horror as being like the queer experience is horror, or like being queer and having horror wrought upon you because you are queer. So you guys are giving me food for thought, though. But I like that. I like, thinking about it in other ways, too.
Thinking about interpretation and literary theory, a lot of queer narratives couldn't be explicitly queer when they were written. So we were discussing before the recording, for example, Dracula or Frankenstein. You could call those queer horror, but it's not, they weren't able to express that explicitly. And I think that that has to be part of the definition as well. And in terms of literary theory, you can interpret a lot of narratives as queer without the author's intent being that, or maybe the author subconsciously maybe thinks about that. Like I'm thinking The Matrix, like I think the author had that intent. However, I think it's not as explicit as it probably could be.
Yeah, I think that this is getting into a lot of the discussions. If you've ever watched the docuseries on Shudder called Queer for Fear, which is a really fun watch, but they talk a lot about queer coding in media, particularly a lot in movies, and before and after the Hays Code and things like that. I think that there is a lot to be said for, as Hailey mentioned, not only saying like, oh, there is queer representation within this story, this game, this medium, but also the presence of certain themes, certain struggles that the characters within these stories have to go through, and potential horror elements that can be emphasized that, like as Holly mentioned, are relatable to the queer experience. Where Creature from the Black Lagoon, like Hailey, you mentioned, it is just this thing hanging out in the swamp and just wants to exist, but people come in and start going after it because it is different.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't know that that's actually the first of a trilogy. By the 3rd movie, they're trying to turn him human, and that reads very strongly to me of conversion therapy.
Whoa, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Damn, I'm going to need to watch these now. I had no idea that there was a trilogy. That's really crazy.
Yeah, there's Revenge of the Creature, and then The Creature Walks Among Us.
Kind of like Fiona going through her journey.
I thought you were going to say "I Walk Among You" as some sort of Black Widow. I mean,
So
it's
am I
okay,
gonna
I'll
have to
take
change
it.
this episode to like queer parentheses Shrek horror?
Yes, pretty much.
Discovering that, she's better off. Anyway, sorry. I'm so sorry. Making a legitimate point, and I'm just...
No, it's all good. I mean, my name does come from Princess Fiona from Shrek. It all comes back around, so it's all fine.
So we talked about some themes that are staples in queer horror, but are there any other narratives or elements that make compelling queer horror?
I mean, I think that's honestly as broad as horror itself. You can pretty much tackle any trope, any subgenre, I feel, and apply a queer reading to it, or have queer protagonists facing it. Just as an example, you could have a vampire story where it is, you have queer characters fighting vampires. You can have ones where the vampirism is a, analogy for queerness. With what you're saying about Dracula is interesting because, like, we speculate about things about Bram Stoker, as we're 130 years later. But it's interesting to note that he was writing that at the time of his friend Oscar Wilde being on trial. Not like, I don't know if that was the exact charge, but it was because he was gay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure they worded it differently in the 1890s. But, that's significant because we do have the ability to make it more overt now.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't think I think anything you think of with horror, you can gel that with queerness. I don't know if that's kind of a terrible answer to that question.
Well, I think it's like the other, like you say, like queerness is something that's othered. So having any kind of monster, not any kind, but, monsters in general, I feel like within a narrative, and that's a lot of horror.
Yeah, there's room for it wherever. Like, I don't think there's a single corner of horror you could go to that is like, no, that there's no way queerness can work in that. I just don't think that exists.
Right. Like, I recall in an earlier discussion that we had with Todd Kiesling, we talked about one of the themes in a lot of his stories is going through a transformation of sorts. And I think that in the stories that we discussed, queerness wasn't really an angle or incorporated in those types, but I think that transformation is a really powerful theme that can be brought in for these queer stories, and it really just depends on how you apply it, both in terms of the characters and struggles and things involved, but then in terms of where is that transformation going? How is it being reacted upon by others? As Hailey, I know in several of your stories, I think Beth has another kind of counterpoint to this, but I often like how thinking in terms of like Queen of Teeth, where you have this character who is dealing with this sort of struggle. I'm trying to avoid spoilers, and I realize I backed myself into a corner here, but it is trying to confront this element that others may deem monstrous. And by the end is sort of embracing that and becoming something new, something different. And often terms wreaking sort of a vengeance on terms of the structures around that we're trying to target them.
Yeah, and that's an example of where it kind of is coming from both the types of queer horror I was mentioning, because you have a lesbian character, Yaya, who is, in this situation. That could have been a straight character who finds teeth between her legs, but then it thematically becomes this other queer narrative because she is transforming, and it does become sort of a transition into this other version of herself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I love that. I was again going back to that point of like what we see. Is it queer code and stuff? Obviously, big example is the Alien movies. Recently, in the first Alien movie, there'd been some theory that got around that quite a number of the main characters were supposed to be transgender, and it sort of revealed in the canon that they were. And it's that sort of thing where we wouldn't necessarily consider it because ultimately the Alien movie there's a big alien in it, and we don't have time to necessarily talk about queerness and stuff. But what I found when I'm running the TTRPG Alien, if it's a lot to do with Marines, a lot of players I've played with, and maybe it's just the kind of content I help produce, stuff like that, people are really keen to have these very close relationships with the other characters. I've run a couple of the predetermined scenarios where you have pre-generated characters who don't necessarily have they just have, in terms of Marines, they have, a status thing, and, they have a buddy and they have a rival. But I had several people going like, well, we want to have a bigger connection because obviously it's a very traumatic time because there's a big alien. To the point where I did jokingly say, like, as long as you don't romance the alien, I do not mind what you do. Obviously, there are certain fandoms out there that will romance the alien, but
certain players took that as a challenge. Yes.
And so you're not no joke, they do. But again, what was so interesting, because I had never considered that. Like, again, maybe very naively, I was like, well, it's a group of Marines of various different gender expressions that are in this town. They've got a mission to do. But actually, no, we're all human beings. We have a mission to do. But also, we're like, I'm really scared now, and I've always fancied you, and I don't have a time to say this otherwise. And it just I just found it really interesting, especially in sci-fi as well. And it's so bleak sci-fi with Alien, obviously, with all the different corporations and all that sort of thing. And yeah, it's just one of those things that, again, I hadn't considered it until I started running these games, and obviously seeing what the players brought to the table. I'm going, oh, actually, that is so bloody cool, because I wouldn't have got that otherwise. So I just wanted to make a note of that. Like, yeah, if you go looking for it, of course it's going to be there, and it's actually so much better when you go look for it, and you find these things.
Yeah, and it's funny because I see that with a lot of different media involving like sci-fi military horror, for example. If you go on Tumblr, pretty much the entire Warhammer 40K fandom is romancing different Space Marines with each other. So I'm not surprised that it crosses over into Alien either.
Which is crazy when you think about the biology of a Space Marine and how that all works out, to be honest.
Well,
but
I'm sure that makes for great fanfic.
Yeah. that was, I think, the first thing my mind went to when you mentioned Hailey, like, people find, queer horror even when it's not explicitly written. I'm like, yeah, judging by the fanfic that I've read, people are definitely finding that queerness in stories, even when you don't
said Tumblr. Tumblr is the only thing I needed to hear.
All my mind is going to now is the Tony the Tiger X Grinch fanfic thing from Tumblr. It's so funny.
Oh yeah.
I think too that you can, like, what you bring to the table, like your personal life experiences kind of inform what you make of horror too. I think about the example I'm about to give is in no way written as horror or ever intended to be, but like my background is that I come from a very like conservative, religious, like that was like most of my life growing up. The expectations of womanhood, being upon me is, you get married, you have children, you are a good wife and a homemaker, yada yada yada. And I remember reading Little Women as a child and thinking like that Joe's story felt like so boxed in, and that Joe herself felt like a boxed in character. And then reading Louisa May Alcott's story, I like her life, and she never had a partner that we know of, and she often expressed disdain with gender roles, and that I think more than once she kind of mused on being a man and like her love of women, and that can be interpreted in many different ways, and I know that we kind of look at it through a modern lens now, but like I said, Little Women isn't written as a horror, but sometimes I think about like Joe and this like life that she has for herself at the end, and the kind of the ending, could be wrong, the ending that Louisa May Alcott wanted for her and then fought with the publisher about, and then ended up having to write for her, where Joe ends up with Laurie as this like love ending that she kind of didn't want in the first place. I don't know, just my own thoughts on it.
No, I think that matters because the thing with a book is the author is bringing stuff and the reader is bringing stuff. And so it ends up being what I see when I write my books, like people are like, you're like, oh, what's the moral of this story? I don't understand. It's like my books, and I'm pretty sure most books, at least for adults, don't have morals. And in my case, I consider them an invitation to conversation. And my side of the conversation is the book. And the reader's side of the conversation is what they get out of that. And that part of that is going to be informed by a personal experience and personal outlook and feelings. And as Lex was saying, horror is such an emotional genre, which is why you can find it in all kinds of different books that aren't necessarily put out as horror. Because if you're feeling that emotion, then that is a moment or a character arc or anything of horror, even regardless of what the book is presented as.
I fully agree. And actually, Holly, related to what you just mentioned, Beth shared a really cool YouTube essay that was on gender as horror. And I actually learned about a new manga series that I really want to read. I can share the link to this essay in the show notes. But the speaker mentioned manga artist Shuzuru Oshimi, who is really well known for stuff like Blood on the Tracks. But this one that they focused on was called Inside Mari, that is not explicitly a horror, but it deals with so many horrific elements. And then there is a really strong trans narrative that is a part and parcel to it. So even though there aren't things like, bloodshed or big scary aliens, things that we may tend to superficially associate with horror, it really does feel like one. And whenever you also read in the author's notes about this story or at the end of a lot of these things, you learn that Oshimi really put a lot of himself and his personal struggles within the story itself, that it is a back and forth between something that the author is aiming to create and then what the audience is sort of getting and working with from that I think it can lead to some really interesting narratives and just thinking about a lot of these things. And a big reason why I'm so excited for this meeting, and oh my God, I said meeting. The reason why I'm so excited for this discussion is where Holly, Beth, and Fiona and I tend to play a lot of tabletop role-playing games. And particularly in terms of RPGs like Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green, and then lots of others, they tend to have historically been written from a predominantly white cishet male perspective. And it is abundantly visible in terms of how these scenarios are laid out. I'll go on for way too long if you don't stop me about a lot of criticisms here and there, but I really wanted to be able to have this open discussion in terms of ways that we may be able to bring in some more of these dynamic and emotional queer narratives, both in terms of representation of characters that we can bring into these scenarios, but also if we wanted to write our own stories, and getting a lot of Hailey's expertise in terms of your skills and creativity in creating these horror novels as more just narrative stories. And then if there's anything that we can try and learn to bring that into a role-playing game kind of perspective. I hope we'll be able to talk, about your writing, your style, and get a lot of your input up here now, and then be able to see how we may try to port that into role-playing games, then hopefully be able to mention some very queer role-playing games that listeners can try and check out if they're interested.
Something I think about a lot, sorry, just going back to the author and the reader having a conversation, whether I think historically it's useful to look at the author's intent. I think in a modern novel, I think that I prefer not to look at those notes. I know that it's useful, but I kind of like going into a book without that knowledge and interpreting it or putting that lens onto it myself without reading it. And I think that's controversial within the realm of this conversation, because I feel like we're talking about the author's intent, and I'm like, I don't want to say I don't care, but I care. I would prefer not to learn about it until maybe afterwards, or maybe not at all.
I think that's completely valid, because when I say the author's side of the conversation, what I mean is the story.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Because, I forget, I'm going to paraphrase this because I can't remember how he said it, but David Lynch famously had said that as the artist, you've already done your side of it by creating the art.
Right.
People are going to ask you to explain it, but you already brought the art. It's for them to work on now. Mm-hmm. So that's like my short story collections. I don't include story notes. And people have gotten on my case about it in the past because they're like, why didn't you tell us about what went into this or what you intended and stuff? It's like, because I already wrote the story. It's for you to read. It's for you to, what did you get out of it? I want to know, I find that much more interesting because every single person is going to have their own perspective. And I think that also relates to what you're talking about with tabletop RPGs, because as a player, you're not going to have the creator of the game typically being like, I meant this mechanic to work that way. I meant for this to do this.
Mhm.
You're going to be bringing your own experience to it and your own decisions, your own ideas. I do think that for most tabletop RPGs, at least I have not played that much, just to be clear. So I don't have a full like expertise on it or anything. But a lot of people will, homebrew different rules and things. I do think there's probably ways to make it so that the actual architecture of the game can work better for players wanting to do different things. But that is going to be depending on the games. Definitely doesn't need to be where everybody's like, okay, I'm going to take D&D and I'm going to try to, twist it into whatever I need. But just, I find there's, related tissue there between, wanting an explanation when it's like, no, you're kind of having to come as a reader in the same way that a player has to come to a game, in the sense that your perspective matters here and your interpretation matters here. And what did it do to you? What did the game session do? What did the story do? How did it make you feel? Horror is such an emotional genre. You have to be open to that truth that's inside you.
I think so for me, and I'm with Beth and I'm with you, Hailey. And this is, just my own personal experience with it, and probably why I kind of react so strongly to it when people are like, well, the author's intent. I'm like, I don't give a shit about the author. I'm sorry. Sorry, Hailey. I don't care. I don't care about the
I'm
author's
so
intent.
sorry.
It is open to like the interpretation of the people that read it. And I think the reason why, though, that I react so strongly to it is because I don't run in like literary analysis circles at all. So the only time I ever hear about like the author's intent, the author's story, the author's background is when people talk about H.P. Lovecraft. And I always am like, I don't give a shit about H.P. Lovecraft and what he brought to the table. Like, I'm interpreting this as really racist, okay? You can't tell me that's not valid or whatever. So
you don't have to know anything about his history to read Reanimator and see how disgusting that story is, as far as how racist it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I find it really interesting that people are asking like, what is the author's intent? Because you're right. Ultimately, we know that queerness is a huge spectrum. I always feel like there's degrees of it, and some people like putting labels on it. Great, good for them. I'm glad they have labels. Some people don't, and that's a-okay as well. But then to ask for a definitive answer to something feels so like. It feels like, well, I need an answer because then I know that I'm right because I got it right. And it says, well, you've got it right. It doesn't matter. And to go back to your point of role-playing games, now I'm just thinking like, the big old D&D, that is like society telling you how to play role-playing games. And
Rules as written.
Rules as written. And like, well, the rule doesn't work for me. And I don't, no, you're wrong. And so it just such an interesting sort of analogy there of the author's intent and, I don't know, the Wizards of the Coast intent for everyone to play the same wizards all the time.
Can you imagine you get to the end of a game session and then emailing customer service at Wizards of the Coast and like, did I do it right? That's what it feels like when it's like, okay, what was the moral of the story? It's like, there isn't one. What did you get out of it?
Mm-hmm.
Listen, I can get an A in reading, and that's a normal thing to want.
I try to get an A in therapy. I understand.
Literally, Beth, all I was thinking was all of our inner former gifted children were just like, please tell me I did it right. I did it right, didn't I?
The answer to that is you finish reading 5 books, and then you buy yourself a personal pizza.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yes. 100%.
That is your A in reading. So you go buy that.
Okay, perfect.
But even then, like, you say like emailing Wizards. I mean, they have their, again, this is too boring and technical for this conversation, but they've got their Unearthed Arcana going like, here's the playtest of rules, and lots of people go, no, that's wrong, and you're like, okay, we're not going to use them anymore. But I just thought that was just such an interesting thing that came to mind. That clamor for these free books that have come out after 50 years, and if they are the right rules for playing this one system.
Yeah.
And obviously we all know there's not one TTRPG system for everyone. But try as they might, they are going to try and, you want to do a horror story? Great. Here it is with the Fifth Edition habits. Oh, you want to do a love story? Fifth Edition, and it's just force feeding you down when we know, ultimately, we don't need any of this. We could just talk to each other and then just, improv it, as I say, and like go, oh yeah, that sounds great. I didn't have that before. That's the beauty of storytelling with so many different people, and conversation with people and playing with different people who have from different life not expectancies, that's really bad, different life experiences, because then you learn so much, not only about where they've come from, but about yourself that you might not even realize. Like, I didn't realize for a long time that I was identified as bisexual until I started playing D and going like, God, these women NPCs, they're great.
God, I'm playing a lot of tieflings. Man.
They're great. Yeah.
That's the other thing I was going to say, is the characters that you choose to make is kind of what you're bringing to it as well. Finding yourself consistently making the same type of character over and over again, being like, maybe there's something here.
I'm feeling very called out right now. I'm going to be honest.
We're all there. We've all done it.
I'm calling at myself.
but it's also a way to like experience these sort of things, like, again, as maybe Holly was referring to, like you wouldn't normally have a chance to do in your real life, but also doing it in a safe place where everyone's like, yeah, absolutely. And also, hopefully, 9 times out of 10, it's not going to end badly for your character, as so often we see in the horror genre. Like, I know I kind of joked about the bury your gays tropes earlier, but that's kind of what happens when you see these things. You're like, oh, that's really sad. And it happens over and go again. Comic books with, the wife in the refrigerator and all that sort of thing to make dramatic stuff. And actually, ultimately, it's just so sad, where you just want these characters to thrive and flourish, because they don't get to do that in real life, currently, depending on your current political climate, I guess.
I think there's probably a conversation worth having. So I think about this when I run RPGs, and it's like when I'm running a game and I have players playing, explicitly queer characters, like they've taken the time to write a character that has this life, this story, yada, yada. And it's like, what can I do to honor that? How can I highlight that without making it, ham-fisted, without making it horror necessarily? Like you of course want to have that conversation with your players about what their lines are and what they want to experience in your game. But obviously, the first thing you don't want to jump to is like, fridging their partner because, oh, well, like maybe this traumatic experience will have some growth opportunity or something. So, and I'm just not sure how to do that, honestly, how to like honor a person's character very much.
I don't have an answer because I don't know much about TTRPGs.
I don't either. Like I'm sitting here mulling on it, and I think that may be something that we can try and figure out over the course of having this as a conversation, because I think that there are a lot of ways to potentially do that. But something that I have joked before that I'm just going to get "it depends" tattooed against my arm, because that is the most common fucking thing that we say. Is it like, oh, so how would I do this in RPGs? Well, it depends. Like, so many things are going to be context dependent, not only within the stories and scenarios we're trying to tell and role play through, but also the players involved. And we mentioned before with like covering things with lines and veils before a scenario starts and identifying themes that players may be more or less interested or comfortable with going through in some of these scenarios. Hailey, it looked like you had something.
Yeah, I think that is a matter of conversation, because that's the thing with writing a book, is that the conversation is done with essentially on my end. And my characters go through it. So it's not so much like it's something you're coming into. It's like if you're going to read one of my stories, you understand that, yeah, this might go fine, or it might not. It could be people are dead in the end, or they could just, have their lives not going right. Or it could be that, good for her at the end. With players, I do think that there is a point where you kind of want to feel it out, but I feel it is just going to depend, because as like Fiona was saying about, there's not going to be one system for everyone. There's not going to be one scenario for everyone. They're an individual person.
And I think that opens up into a nice segue as, Hailey, a lot of your novels will blend queer and cosmic horror in the most batshit of ways. I mean, this is a huge compliment. And I'm really curious how you come to really walk this line, and like, what is your process of linking so many different ideas and imageries together? Like, I was really surprised in reading through The Worm and His Kings, where there was so much imagery that I did not expect at all from the outset. And we'll get into in terms of like pacing and things like that a bit later. But yeah, how do you link a bunch of these ideas together that as a reader, it's just like, what the fuck, as I'm turning page to page?
It's funny because I just saw, like, our early readers have early copies of A Game in Yellow digitally, and I saw somebody today is like, their review is pretty much what the fuck and then 5 stars. So it's just like, oh, well, that's nice.
That deserves to go on the back of the book. Yeah.
But yeah, well, I think as far as taking these kind of out there scenarios from cosmic horror, I think what's important for me is, one, I have my concepts, and 2, I have my characters, because you know, an assumption with cosmic horror is that it is a situation like, well, humans don't matter. It's kind of about the nature of the universe and stuff. It's like, well, yeah, that might be, what the actual elements of it are. Laird Barron has mentioned that Jack London's To Build a Fire is a cosmic horror story. You wouldn't think of it as one because it's basically a guy who's lost in the Arctic and needs to build a fire or he's going to die. And you wouldn't think of that as cosmic horror, but like, any speculative concept you have which has to do with forces that big is similar to, the weather is killing you. It's not trying to kill you. It's just doing it because that's what it does in that part of the world. And there's a passage in there where it says, like, the coldness of space beating at the northmost tip of the world, and he just happens to be on it while that's happening. So I think with cosmic horror, you kind of have to zoom out. It's like, but that's not to say that people don't matter. And that's where you get into the character stuff, because a person matters to themselves. And that is going to tie into that greater cosmic force, because you still want to survive that cosmic force, whether it's weather or like an eldritch god or just some weird device that's been left behind by aliens a million years ago that's just still doing its thing. I think that connection is what's most important, and how it breaks that kind of existential threat or existential problem in some cases. As far as descriptions, I don't know. It's just, I kind of write what makes sense to me. I'm going to guess it's probably similar to what DM has to do. Like, you're having to do things on the fly a lot of the time. You don't know what your players are going to say at any given moment sometimes, and you kind of have to think fast and react. And I feel like I'm doing that a lot of the time when I'm writing, because I am figuring out how to, I have the thoughts in my head. I have like a plan, but I don't exactly know how I'm going to say it until I do. And sometimes it's that I'm sitting doing something else, or I'm doing the laundry or whatever, and a phrase occurs to me and I run across the apartment to go write it down real fast. Other times I'm sitting there and it's just like kind of letting it flow into, like, for example, The Worm and His Kings, what the nature of like the Sunless Palace is going to look like, or how I'm going to describe the fungal bioluminescence around that area, or how much. And the thing is with that, it's kind of how much to show. Like, I don't want to sit there and describe the Gray Maiden, from head to toe. It's dark.
It feels very king coded.
It's dark. I want it to be like, okay, you see the hands, you see like the shape, but you don't see the clarity. You don't see the details. And that's something that can be revealed as it goes on. Yeah, it's kind of just, it's a lot of intuitive aspects, I think.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that as well. What I find is when I'm doing GMing horror, like, less is more, because ultimately I have a vision of what I think the creature looks like, but whatever I say will not project the same image into all the other players. Yep. So exactly as you say, Hailey, maybe I'll describe a small part of them, and it's up to the players then to go, well, if that's the horrific small part of them, what is the small part attached to, and yeah, obviously, I mentioned alien earlier, so obviously we all know what an alien looks like, but you describe them, as some sort of horrific creature that feels like it's swimming through water, even though it's walking towards you.
Yeah.
That's sort of like anything like that. There's small and concise, and yeah, the same thing with authors as well. I can imagine like you have maybe an image in your head of what it is, but to then choose your words so delicately to describe them, and then like you don't know what the your reader's going to do. And again, it's like yeah, what the fuck? 5 stars is from whatever the descriptions you put up there.
Right. I fully agree. I think with horror, especially, less is more in terms of your creatures. You mentioned Alien before. I think that Alien is a case in point of it is what you don't see that can be so terrifying. When you are just looking at dark hallways and you see a flicker of a shadow, you are going to be on edge. You're looking for something about it. And whenever you're dealing with ways to amplify tension and horror in readers is, I think about whenever I was a little kid and my dad owned a video rental store, and I would always walk through the horror VHS aisle and I would look at the art on the covers and it would terrify me. And I was like, I would read the back descriptions and I'm like, my imagination was always 10 times worse than what was actually in the movie itself. And whenever you are describing these entities, Hailey, like you mentioned with the Gray Maiden, that if you just describe some elements related to them, you see just a flash of something, a part of an anatomy, or evidence of what they have done, in terms of cosmic horror, I'm thinking in terms of like Annihilation. We just see like what it has done, and we don't know what the before and during looks like. And that leaves it to the reader or the player to really start thinking it through. And that's when you can amp up a lot of horror, because once something is known, it ceases to be an element of horror and it becomes an obstacle to be overcome. Whenever you're dealing with some kind of a threat, I think that it's really important to have some sort of mystery related to it, because once your players figured out, of course they're weak to fire damage and I can do this ritual to not, like, that becomes D&D. Like, it's just, this is now a tactical combat and it's less surviving against the unknown.
And I think that's why it's important to have development of the elements of the story. And that obviously works with games very well, because you are going to have to continue to bring in different elements of the scenario that you're running. One of the things that I sometimes struggle with in a book or a movie, like a horror book or movie, is that you kind of, sometimes the thing is set up and that's all it is for the rest of the story, versus, as was said, have some mystery to it. I mean, there can be something that has to be uncovered, and I think that works very well for a game, especially. But just that there are parts of it that you don't know. There's something worse. Once you've learned something, that's like, okay, cool. There's something worse behind that, and maybe something even worse behind that. Either an implication or another thing, or even just something sensory. Because one of the things I love with it's harder with movies, but with books and probably with games, since you're giving a description, you can get into more than sight. You can get into sound, touch, scent, taste. It becomes very immersive. And I think that is especially good for horror and for romance too. Horror and romance to me are closely related genres. They are the ones that are most about emotion, and they're most about suspense.
When you were talking about the something behind it, I was thinking specifically of Your Mind is a Terrible Thing. I was thinking about that first encounter, and then like, what's the actual thing? Anyway, not to go into spoilers. One that I won't spoil the ending, but it is that's definitely one that like escalates every couple chapters. You're onto some new problem, and it's just each time it's like, oh, this is much worse than it appeared. Yeah. Well, with the romance thing, I comment in the chat, but I was thinking of once the couple gets together, that's the tension broken. So you have to figure out what to do for the next 5 books.
Well, I think that's why a lot of, like, at least as far as I'm aware, a lot of romance series, they refocus on a different couple in the same universe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can tell which one is going to be the next one in the usually. This is a complete pivot, I think, but thinking about your mind is a terrible thing and the light most hateful, the theme that I kind of noticed was being relentlessly pursued and consumed by a homogeneity or something unknown, and the helplessness that the protagonist felt. I saw a couple of parallels. I'm not done A Light Most Hateful yet, so I'm not sure if this comes back, but I saw a lot of parallels in Alto and Olivia in terms of helplessness and being, I guess, different, having differences and trying to escape from that homogeneity. Is that a theme that you would sort of ascribe to queer horror? And is that something intentional that you?
I don't know that it was intentional, at least not consciously.
Okay.
I do realize now that you compare them, they're both anxious characters.
I related.
But I think that's just something with me, but I do think that now that you're saying that it applies to queer. That's the other thing, like, stuff that comes into the book is sometimes just like in the same way that if you're playing a TTRPG and you keep coming up with similar characters to play, sometimes you're putting in the similar kinds of threats or themes or scenes into things, and it's like, maybe that's an issue that I haven't worked on. And so perhaps that's an issue, is like this fear of being absorbed into some homogeneity. I think is understandable, especially for like, I think that does make sense for queer horror, because there is this concern of like, just go back in the closet or just stay in the closet. Just make it easier for everybody else and be like everyone else. So yeah.
Well, it's even like you just mentioned with the creature from the Black Lagoon 3, that it's the same. It is being pursued and forced into this kind of conversion, just because the big air quotes society can't stand that this just thing that it deems as strange exists and is trying to force it to look like itself.
And Shrek.
I'm going to kick you from this meeting.
Yeah. And I think the thing with The Light Most Hateful, and even more so with Your Mind's Terrible Thing, is that it seems, on the cosmic element of it, it seems to be happening automatically, because, and that is kind of heteronormativity if you think about it, because at this point, a lot of people aren't going like, I'm going to decide to be heteronormative about things. It's that is the assumption, and it becomes automatic. Like a lot of things in our society.
That was the other point, was the protagonists are being sort of thrust into these horrors unwilling, and they're sort of being forced to make that choice, overcoming their own anxieties.
Yeah.
You mentioned that earlier in terms of the elements that you tend to bring into your writing, that it's often the characters that you have involved need to confront and overcome some internal struggles within themselves to then try and deal with the horrors that are going on around them, whatever shape that they may be. Could you talk about that a little more in terms of like how you tend to try and make that happen depending on the characters that you create, or how does that work for you?
I mean, I think it depends on the book and the story and the characters, because like A Game in Yellow, without spoiling anything, since the book doesn't come out for a couple months still, by chapter 2, the characters be like, should I go to therapy? And it's like, no. And honestly, the rest of the book would not happen if she had just gone to therapy. So it really does depend on, are you willing to confront the horror in yourself? Are you willing to confront your past? Are you willing to confront the things that have happened to you and what they've made of you? I wouldn't say that a character is necessarily like, okay, either you confront your personal problems or you can't defeat, this situation.
Right.
Especially because sometimes you confront your personal problems and you still can't win. But I do think that, I think it's important to have it. And this is kind of, again, with like TTRPGs, you have the outer issue, but each character has their own arc, their own, like, you would have a character come up with their own personal like story stuff that they're going to have to deal with within the course of the campaign or scenario. And that probably would help with, as far as queer horror goes, as far as making more of that available, because it is a very personal thing. And with, like, you mentioned like Call of Cthulhu earlier, you have a choice when you're running something like that. If it's like in that setting, in that time period, are you going to decide this is a version of that time period where actually everybody's really cool about, queerness? Are you going to do it more kind of like how it would be back then, where it's like, yeah, it's kind of like it's going to be, underground. It's going to be hidden to some degree, depending on your situation. That's most situations at the time. As far as I'm understanding, Call of Cthulhu, I believe it's usually set in the 1920s, 1930s, right?
So, as written, a lot of the official, like, Chaosium published Call of Cthulhu stuff is written in that 20s and 30s, but there was a lot of fan-created Call of Cthulhu scenarios that are, they can range in any time frame. And a lot of what we tend to do on this podcast is reanimate a lot of published Call of Cthulhu scenarios and sometimes adapt them to bring them up into a modern timeline, because just my personal bias, I don't really like doing things within the 20s and 30s for a lot of those reasons. And it's either, oh, are we really going to roleplay bigotry at the table for this? Or we just sort of hand wave it and say, like, no, I am not going to do that. This is you're in a pretty chill area. We're not going to worry about it. But it's a tough situation no matter what. So that's where we try and bring things into at least a moderately contemporary setting.
And so with that said, one of my books, Cruel Angels Past Sundown, takes place in the, I think, 1880s.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing with it is there's not really, like, most of the characters are queer in some degree. And that's kind of what makes it so don't really have to deal with much bigotry from it, because they all know each other.
Mm-hmm.
And they all know each other's queer. They've kind of like, it's not necessarily like people are like, oh, is it like a found family? It's like, I wouldn't say that, but it is a community. And, that's an option you can have. If everybody here is queer, then you're probably not going to have that issue so much, whether it's overt or just kind of implied.
Right. That makes me think a lot of one of the systems I was going to mention sort of towards the end of this is called Moonlight on Roseville Beach, which is a really, really cute system. The vibes are immaculate, but essentially it is kind of an island or peninsula community that is in the 1970s for disco, queer, cosmic horror. And so you can play any sort of person, merman, werewolf, alien, a witch's familiar, sort of whatever you want on this island. But it is a community of queer folks, and that they really need to resolve a lot of their own issues and the cosmic horrors that are affecting this area, because the mainland that's where you have that heteronormative oppression, and like the police from the mainland won't really respond in time, or if they do, you may not want them involved at all. And so, yeah, trying to potentially have sort of these like social islands. I don't know, that's not really a term, but just trying to, I don't even know what I'm saying anymore.
You made it a term.
Yeah, sure. It's a term now.
But I mean, that's the kind of scenario that I think does make it more welcoming to queer horror, because you put it in a situation where it's like, where that does affect things. But so there's kind of a, how do I put it? Kind of a dual situation. Like, yeah, you don't want to involve the outside, and you also have each other, but there's still a threat here. So it is a matter of decisions and such. Like, A Light Most Hateful makes it a little easier, because the only reason for Olivia to stay is because she's used to it there. And so once everything goes to hell by like chapter 3, it's like, okay, time to leave finally. But in a situation like that, you wouldn't want to do that. You would want to resolve things in some capacity.
Mm-hmm. And just thinking kind of about like what Beth mentioned in terms of these themes of being relentlessly pursued by some entity, since this is horror, we can always crank it up to 11 to like up the weirdness and up the threat and danger and things, but essentially being pursued by this heteronormativity to just consume anything that is individual or unique about the protagonists and either just turn it into this homogenous mass or leave them kind of brain dead zombies. I've also noticed, again, trying to avoid specific spoilers at least, but in some of your other titles, that the protagonists are often befallen with really unfair fates from a hateful world. And eventually they have this kind of either embracing this monstrousness or they kind of merge with a different sort of monstrous element. And it reminds me a lot of, thinking of stories like Ginger Snaps in terms of werewolf types of horror movies and media that can have this queer coding in them, that if this is the monster that you may think of me or call me, then they embrace that and really wreak havoc on this Nancy Reagan dystopian Americana all around them. And even though these endings aren't necessarily happy, they do leave me with a feeling of like, you know what, good for her. We didn't need reality to exist, actually. Like, it feels good. And I'm really curious how you plot out these conclusions or processes whenever you're writing, because like all of this is really dynamic and I think would be interesting to try to incorporate within a tabletop role-playing game, because I've only run into a couple of scenarios where the player characters would actually have an opportunity to embrace the weird cosmic horrors happening and become something else, because the mundane horrors of the world around them are kind of worse because people fucking suck a lot of the time. I'll stop talking.
I'll say that that's often an option for my character.
This is true. This is very true.
I have a track record.
So I think even with those titles, it goes to Beth's point about being pursued by this homogeneity, because in The Worm is Kings, it's the cult. Even though the different cultists have their own interpretations of the worm, it's still, come do what we want you to do, come be part of this. And honestly, in Queen of Teeth, there's barely a solid like antagonist that isn't just the corporation. There are faces to it, but like the board members don't even have names, and they don't even have personalities. They're just like, it's like the one on the left, the one on the right, the one in the middle.
And it feels like the main threats are like the corporation and society in general. Like, it's a shitty world to be in.
Well, that's what happens when Nancy Reagan becomes president. But yeah, and I think that element, it's kind of hard to say how you get there, because The Worm and His Kings had a certain ending, and then pretty early on I knew that Monique wasn't going to do that ending, and it changed.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Queen of Teeth, right up until the end, I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen, and I ended up backtracking a little and rewriting a bit, and it got to where it's like, oh, that's what would happen. And I do think that's a matter of the characters, whether they're the type of person. Like, for example, if let's say we rip Alto out of Your Mind is a Terrible Thing and drop them into Queen of Teeth, I don't think they'd make the same decisions Yaya would.
Right.
And I don't think that they do what happens at the end. I just don't see that personality there. So I do think it's a matter of what kinds of characters the players have created. Also, the willingness to just kind of not worry about whether everyone around deserves it or not, because honestly, not everyone deserves what happened at the end of The Worm is Kings, but it's still a horror book. It's still a horror story. And so sometimes everybody gets it. And then the character becomes the cosmic horror. The character becomes that hurricane that doesn't care if you're a good or bad person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just from what you were saying about that idea of like the big bad corporations or the sort of the eldritch beings, they don't have this personality necessarily. It's all bland. And then couple that with the idea of like this vastness that you are nothing. So why not just join and be a part of the machine, right? Be a part of it. And so, yes, you're labeled as monstrous, perhaps because certainly nowadays, thinking of Gen Z and younger, they are so we are all so keen on our individualism, and people, like I said, people have labels, but they know what they want. We go all the way down to our style choices, what we look like. That's so precious to us, and being able to express ourselves. And so I think that's always a big tension in horror in general, but I think maybe in queer horror, that idea of like you're fighting to preserve your individualistic like personality against this wash, whether it be supernatural or corporations or anything, and not to be consumed. And it goes back to that, are you the monster? And whether you take it or not. And I think it's so interesting when you present that to players and they do a move and you're like, I did not expect you to do that, but that's what I want. I want people to make that choice, to sacrifice themselves to save others or save the future or anything like that. Because why are we seeing this group of players compared to any other day where they could just be a normal, in quotation marks, mundane person, but it's because they have this individual characteristic, which I don't think is necessarily queer. I will say that because I don't want to conflate those two things, but I just think it's so interesting when we're talking about it this now, and what you just made me think of that idea of like everything just subsumes into nothingness, this bland soup.
And that's actually a perfect way to put it, because, we have a lot of systems going on where it is treated like a machine and people are supposed to be cogs. And that means the cogs need to be a particular shape to make the machine continue running. And if enough of those cogs are squares or circles or whatever else, the machine can't run. So it's like, okay, you have to get into the correct shape. And I think that also goes to Lex with your question about how to kind of guide players in this. I was actually thinking about this week because I didn't realize until literally 5 days ago, like the day before we were looking over kind of like how to frame certain things with this, I didn't realize The Worm and His Kings was a good for her story until that point. And I was like, I had to type up a rundown of the plot from beginning to end. And I got to the end and it's like, wait a second, this is a good for her story. And I think one of the key elements of getting to that point where it becomes that, like, you know what, I'm breaking the machine. I can't worry about what happens to the other cogs because this needs to stop. And and you become that hurricane, that cosmic force, that kind of thing that isn't going to, worry about the morality of it so much, is that it isn't them trying to kill the character, whether they're in a book or whether they're played by a player. It's because they need to be exploited. That happens with Monique. She is being exploited through The Worm and His Kings. She doesn't know it necessarily until later, but that is the case. And Yaya, very early on, is like, they want to experiment on me. They want their whatever genetic data they can get because they want to make products that they can sell. It is not about killing her necessarily. It is about exploiting her. So it's possible that if you have scenarios where the threat is, obviously there are points in both those stories where they can get killed, but it's possible that, something that might guide players towards those types of situations is less that they're being threatened to be killed, just that, and more that they are threatened to be exploited.
I really like that because I think with a lot of scenarios, particularly with a lot of published Call of Cthulhu scenarios, they tend to be a bit formulaic in terms of you are regular people, you get a letter from your relative, you get some kind of inheritance, you go to a new location, things are not what they seem, you investigate, there is a big monster, you run to try and survive, the end. And, as GMs and writers within this horror role-playing game genre, I'm really looking for ways to try and bring something new or different, as a lot of the scenarios that are the most memorable to me bring something that I didn't expect. It leads my characters or the players' characters to make decisions that they had not really been confronted with before. And having that kind of novelty and exploring a lot of those emotions, like Hailey, as you mentioned, that horror is a really emotional genre, that this is what we're really trying to elicit. We're trying to make someone uncomfortable by exploring some of these themes within controlled environments. Like, we're not trying to hurt anyone or make them feel bad, but it is kind of testing these limits. I don't have a point here. I'm just... this is causing gears to click.
and that's why we talk about these things, to just kind of like have those little click moments.
And I know in some of your social media posts, you have mentioned that some readers can reference some of your works as cosmic horror, even though you really didn't think of it in terms of writing that at the time. What elements do you think that some of these readers are kind of latching onto when they're calling it cosmic horror? Is it like the Jack London, where it is a ostensibly mundane story, but you are just brushing against that insignificance of the human experience despite its importance to each of us?
It honestly, that depends on the story because, well, for example, Light Most Hateful was one where like a month after release, people were like, oh, this new cosmic horror novel from Hailey Piper. And I was like, oh, that's its genre. Because I was calling it a small town horror. And I was like, it never felt quite adequate because it goes off the rails like probably a third of the way through.
What? One of your books going off the rails? I'm shocked.
But after people were saying, it's like, oh yeah, and like not, I don't want to get into spoilers, but you find out something with the background a little after the middle point of the book. You find out something that happened in the past that's like didn't have to happen. It's just this outer catalyst that is the whole reason everything else happens. And I was like, oh yeah, yep, it's very straightforwardly a cosmic horror story once somebody said that. Something like Queen of Teeth, I have no freaking idea why people call it a cosmic horror story. I do not know.
Right.
I don't know if it's because there's tentacles. And I'm just like, I feel like that's a little myopic to be like, oh, there's tentacles coming out of her hoo-ha, so it's cosmic horror. But there may be some other element because later in the story, there is a short chapter about kind of what existence is and kind of what it takes to rebuild a mind that has been destroyed, and whether you could do that if you made a replica of someone's brain and made it start to live, how much of that is that person versus just that tissue. So maybe that, or who knows? I honestly am a little perplexed by it. Somebody just called Cranberry Cove a cosmic horror story to me last week, and that's more of a crime story. And I'm just like, it's about like kind of a haunted hotel. I think there's some occult stuff in it. I don't know if I would classify as cosmic horror, so that one's confusing to me too. But there's others where it's just like they're not. I wouldn't say the whole book is cosmic horror, but they'll have a moment of it. No Gods for Drowning, for example, most of that is not cosmic horror, but there's 2 chapters in like the last third of the book where it's like, and I knew I was doing that. I knew I was bringing cosmic horror stuff, and I'm just like, let's just upset everyone who thought I wasn't going to do cosmic horror here. This is, and a couple of people said, oh, that was your best cosmic horror, those couple of chapters. So it's really just, I think I just have a very weird worldview, and I blame Clive Barker for doing that to me. Because I saw Hellraiser when I was much too young, and it didn't traumatize me the way I think it did some other people with the hooks and chains and blood and bondage stuff. But it did open my brain as far as this idea that like what we consider the physical world that we count on is just paper as far as reality is concerned. And you can, with the right elements, a sound, a magic word, shapes, like, things like that, like you see in Call of Cthulhu, that you can rip open that paper and then wish you hadn't.
That's really interesting you mentioned that, because it's making me think of, I loved the description that, oh my God, I'm blanking on her name. Oh my God, Dee, but I don't remember her full name.
Donna?
Donna, thank you.
In The Worm and His Kings.
Yes, well, and Even the Worm Will Turn, I really loved the description that Donna was giving in terms of the worm's path through the universe and in dark times, sort of making these wormholes and drawing this Y, talking about our world and this world. And no one ever thinks to realize that this timeline is just on paper. And they don't think about what is underneath this paper as she like lifts it up and looks at the shadow that's on the table. that I think that it's a very, not exactly timey-wimey, but just like a world-bendy view that is really spot on for cosmic horror in terms of we are so used to seeing, experiencing, and thinking of the world only within our frames of reference. And then to completely shatter that is something that's really fun.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's why I end up going to cosmic horror a lot of the time. It's just like, it's part of the world that we think is so secure. How can we mess with that?
Yeah.
And how horrible would that be?
Well, just to tie it back to the intro, talking about the limits of existence as part of cosmic horror. So pushing against that.
Yeah.
Exactly what you're saying. I'm just trying to tie it back to our definition.
And you didn't even mention Shrek. I'm proud of you.
But you did.
Damn
Yeah.
it.
Cut it out.
What, Lex, why are you always bringing up Shrek?
Yeah, I don't know what you're
Oh my
talking
God.
about.
Don't gaslight me.
Boo.
I'm just going to bleep it every time.
No, Shrek is cosmic horror because a donkey and a dragon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yes.
'cause donkeys are. Anyway, I'm going to stop.
No,
now.
no, keep
I
going.
don't even know
derailing.
how the genetics of that work
Exactly.
as far as like I'm like, wow, this world it's either magic or it's just like, wow, what is the evolutionary track that like diverges slightly between donkeys and dragons?
Yeah.
And then they're kind of bringing that back.
Well, you see, Hailey, if you go read my fanfic, it'll look
Check out RPG Reanimators
part
on
of your-
AO3.
It's part of your world
Yes.
building is that you explain in detail
Oh,
the
no.
genetics of donkeys and dragons in this world. Perfect. I'll collab with you on that.
But actually, in thinking of like explaining some elements in detail or explaining just these quick glimpses of things, I often praise your work for being really snappy and quick to hook the reader's attention. And there's not really a lot of downtime. It feels like the characters are in this situation. There's fucked up things happening, and we sort of get these flashbacks that give us glimpses of the character. So while reading, I feel like I was learning about Monique the longer the story went on, rather than I get the I was born David Copperfield kind of introduction, because I think that, going into our earlier discussion with you can over explain the monster or whatnot, and it kind of saps the horror out of it. Going into too much depth up front can really sap a lot of the engagement out of developing these characters or developing the action and the plot at hand. Do you have any advice for how to set up these kind of quick, efficient stories?
Just throw them in, because honestly, if they're not going to die right away, then you're going to get to spend some time with them and you're going to learn who they are, both through flashbacks, perhaps, or conversations, or honestly, just their actions, because you're going to learn a lot about a person from how they react to being chased by a big monster or whatever else. And if they're going to die early, then they're probably not the protagonist. So it's up to you whether that matters or not. If that person who dies early does matter, then you have to make them matter to that character who you are going to spend a bunch of time with. Even if that just is a line or two, just to make it matter. But honestly, yeah, I'm just like, I was a guest editor on a magazine, and one of the big issues I saw with a lot of the stories that came in is that they'd be these 20-page stories that didn't start until 10 pages in. And there's just no need for that. And maybe that's me being like not having as much patience as I could, but I apply that to my stories as well, because I have to read them more than anybody else does. I have to read them over and over and over and over. And it's like, I don't want to sit through a bunch of stuff before the story gets started. I want to, let's get going. We have time. You're going to be with them for however much. So you'll learn about them as we go.
I just want to quickly comment on, because I have a theory about why maybe TV and film is getting worse in that sense, but in a sense
Yes,
of like,
No, go. You're right.
because it is, I know, but in the sense of like, again, no spoilers for it, and I know it's not really related to what we're talking about, but Doctor Who recently, okay? I have many different opinions on it, but what I've noticed is that every time you watch it, the exposition just talks about what is happening right now, as if you've just looked up from your phone and they're just giving you a recap constantly. And that's the thing I've seen with all the TV shows and films. It's because they expect you, the viewer, not to be paying attention. It's something that's on in the background. Whereas you can't do that with a book. You shouldn't be doing that with a TTRPG thing. So that's why, again, I definitely agree with you, Hailey, and that idea is like we'll find out more about these characters, both in the story, because you're going to have to go with them on this journey to tell the story. Whereas a film, you could be watching it and then go, oh, I'm just going to pause and get myself a drink, come back, oh, okay, where was I? And so it's trying to almost like water everything down so that, because they just assume you're not watching this purely as the thing. And I got to that point now where I'm just there with horror, especially. I think horror films and stuff, unless it's something very, very specific, and they've deliberately chosen to rate it in a way, like The Substance, for example, is, I think, immaculate in terms of storytelling, because it's not really too much in terms of dialogue. You can infer certain things from different people about what is going on and the way it's presented and stuff like that, which I know is slightly different. But I've realized with TV and stuff like that, it is just getting to the point where it's just saying, you've just looked up, here's a repeating of what we just said. And I'm just like, and it's just so frustrating. So yeah, I just wanted to just chime in on that.
There is an article about that, actually. I can find it, that I read recently. The other thing is, it's like, the evolution of TV is so interesting to me. So it used to be, the episodic things happening in sitcoms and nothing significant happening to each of the characters. And then prestige TV happening where it's assumed that you're watching it all in one go, or you're watching it
sequentially.
And now it's assumed that you're watching it in the background. And so it's like the evolution of that is so interesting to me. There is an article, I'll find it, but
well, the Netflix apparently had started instructing some writers to frame their scripts as like to have that repetition, to have that. And I'm just like, why are you making it for the people who aren't paying attention? If they don't even want to watch the thing, then what is the point? Just make stuff for the people who actually want to watch this stuff. And honestly, with books, it can happen because people skim.
Yeah.
And with audiobooks, they sometimes tune out if they're doing other stuff. So you can stop paying attention. And unfortunately, it does happen with TTRPGs, because I've had that happen years and years ago when I did play D&D a little bit. People kind of just zoning out. And then like, okay, so especially in combat, I was just like, okay, so what are we doing? And it's just like, you're making things worse for everybody. Why? If you don't want to be part of it, why are you even here? For the snacks?
Oh, Holly doesn't have any experience with that.
Oh my God. Yeah. No. I was actually reflecting on this a couple of days ago with my partner. We were talking about like the cyclical nature of popular media. We had the vampires and we had the zombies and we had the superheroes, and we were kind of reflecting on like what comes next, what's next, and how often things that are like people are worried about or thinking about starts becoming like really popular media, like with the rise of Hunger Games and like the concern of a dystopian future and things like that. And I swear, like my prediction right now is that we're going to start seeing a rise in like horror or sci-fi that focuses on like AI or even just like screen addiction and like people not like looking up and paying attention and things like that. But that's just Holly's prediction.
I think you're right. And I don't even think it'll necessarily be like it's going to be phones or like AI or robots in them. It'll be things that are symbolizing that or work that same way. And I confess that I am guilty of that with something that I can't talk about yet. Not that it's a robot or something, but it's like, if you read between the lines, it's something pretending to be something it isn't, and present itself as, art or as a person or whatever in the same way that these programs do.
I'm trying to remember, there was a horror documentary that I watched that it was just on the thing that Holly was talking about, where you can tell what was important in terms of social pop culture by the types of horror movies that tend to come out 1 or 2 years later. Like thinking about when cell phones were starting to get really popular and everyone was on their phones, that's whenever you have like one missed call and things, and you get into like fear.com and Pulse whenever the internet was just starting to come out and be a thing. That finding these representations of whatever seems to be the modern problem as it were, at least according to daytime talk shows.
I had a really interesting conversation actually with the guys over on the Good Friends of Jackson Elias podcast, and we talked about space horror and corporate horror. And I was like musing on like, where did corporate horror come from? Where did cyberpunk come from? And Scott Dorward was like, oh, that came from Reaganism and hypercapitalism. And he's like, there's a whole psychology behind that. And like people saw this hypercapitalism coming and that scared them. And that's what they wrote about. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. I love like the psychology behind why we write the things that we do. You know, I think that's just so interesting.
In author circles, we call that being called out.
So while we have you here, I would be remiss if I didn't take a personal opportunity to ask you about some of your usage of the King in Yellow and the Carcosa mythos that you used in A Game in Yellow. I obviously have not read it because it hasn't come out yet, but I'm currently running Beth and some other friends through the campaign Impossible Landscapes, which is really King in Yellow focused. And I'm excited to use this book for a lot of new inspiration. So yeah, if you want to talk about how you integrated and used all of this.
You may not want to use this book for
I know it's very horny too. So
yes, yeah. Unless you do want to use it that way. My approach to it was to kind of, I didn't want to get into a lot of the mythos that has been built over the last 130 years. I kind of wanted to focus on kind of the framework that's used in the Chambers stories, in the sense that it's less about the world within the play and more about what the play does to people. And so you have Carmen, who's the main character. She's got her own personal problems, and the play seems like a solution to that, because the premise is that her and her partner are kind of doing more and more extreme kink stuff to kind of heighten her libido, because Carmen is having personal issues inside and she's not sure why. And they meet another woman named Smoke, who introduces the King in Yellow to them. And it's like, okay, just you can read a couple paragraphs of this play. And then she closes the book, and the survivor's euphoria is what gives Carmen like kind of her libido back and is helping with her relationship. But the problem is she kind of just becomes more obsessed with it. She wants another try with it. She wants a bigger experience with it. And it starts to, one of the main things with the King in Yellow and the Chamber stories is that it contains irresistible truths. And my thinking was, that's not going to be the same thing for everyone. It's going to be about Carcosa. It's going to be about, this world and the Hyades and such. But it's not necessarily going to look like the same thing for every person. So it's going to contort itself to be irresistible to you, whoever's the reader. So when you're reading, you get a bit more of the play in this book than you would in the Chamber stories, and get to see a little more Carcosa. But there is a question of, is this actually the substance of this? Was there a place? Is there a place? Or is this just a malevolent item that is contorting itself to mess with this individual person, because that's what it does. And as you see it kind of affect other people in the book, you wonder the same. What did they see? What are they going through? What is irresistible to them? And what is the ultimate result that's going to come of them reading this book? But I kind of grabbed onto little bits of what we get from the Chamber stories, the different cities, Alar, Carcosa, Hastur, the fact that it's not really clear whether King Hastur is the King in Yellow or if there's something else. It isn't clear who the stranger is. Things are not spelled out in these stories. So there's a lot of like, this is also that. Mm-hmm. And so you have characters who are in masks. Like Carmen is often seeing a golden masquerade where Casilda and Camilla are there, but there are other characters too. And it's just a lot of like, who is actually this? Is there another, like when you pull off the mask, there's a face, but is that also a mask? Kind of a lot of questions of ambiguity and trickery and deceit happening. And how much of that is how someone's lying to you, and how much of it is you lying to yourself.
Hell yeah.
I don't know if that answered your question in a useful way.
I don't know, but I'm fucking hyped to read it. Like, that's a really cool perspective on it that I haven't seen or considered before. Like I had a little arrangement of questions to be like, ooh, what's this? What's that? Because I've been thinking about it in one certain perspective, but that's a very new approach to it.
Yeah, I don't know if any of you have seen this Mike Flanagan movie from a few years ago, Oculus. The mirror in that movie is kind of how my perspective of the King in Yellow is. That is a thing that it doesn't. It's clearly like this is a line from I forget her name, but she was on Doctor Who.
Karen Gillian.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Fiona, it's your time to shine.
Everybody just jumped in.
Sorry.
There's a line that she says that is like, it clearly knows how to defend itself. And that stuck with me as like, imagine imagine anything around your house that you consider disposable. And imagine it knows how to defend itself. It knows how to affect reality around you to protect itself. And that's kind of my perspective on the King in Yellow. It's just like, maybe this is a portal to this other world, or maybe it's just an item that is smarter than the people around it and knows how to get what it needs and wants from those people. Is it messing with your mind, or is this stuff actually happening? I just think it's a very, that was the way I read the Chambers stories, was that this is a very elusive item. This is an item that understands people better than they understand themselves and knows how to mess with them.
This is getting into some of our friend Nathan's interpretations from his runs of Impossible Landscapes in terms of, is this actually some kind of I don't want to say all powerful, but is this some kind of massive is this some kind of like dimension that actually is reality? Or is it just telling you that? Because getting into a more subjectivist framework that, we each are little brains that are Gundam piloting meat suits, and we are generating our own understandings of the world around us. And if our brains become convinced that this actually is the reality and it's warping that perspective, it's, can we look at it as, is that actually true, or is it just convincing us that that is true? And is there really a difference by the end of it?
Yeah, because, well, it's like, because you look at Schrodinger's cat, for example, and the whole thing is like, is the cat is simultaneously, is it alive? Is it dead? In a quantum state, is it simultaneously alive and dead? What if you're the cat?
I would simply exit the box. Oh, sorry.
Cats don't do that. They love boxes.
That's true.
That's a very good point, actually.
Unless there's a smaller box.
True. But what does that mean on a cosmic car, scale?
I was actually thinking about perspective, colors and things like that, right? There's a theory that we don't see color in the same way.
Oh, yeah.
And like people that are colorblind, that skews
We don't see colors. We see light. We don't actually see we aren't actually seeing, like, here's my mouse. I'm not actually seeing this. I'm seeing light that is like refracted off of this, which is why we get colors and illusions. The world's fun.
So somebody who is colorblind, has a different perspective, and that might skew how they view certain things. Anyway.
And see, I think that'd be interesting to have a character like that encountering something like the King in Yellow and see how much that changes things. Would they be immune to it? I think that's interesting.
Yellow?
Someone walking and then this red cloak. It's like, what? No, the yellow one. I don't know what you're talking about.
There's a dog. They see in black and white.
Yeah, right. I mean, if the dog could read, I guess. Would Wishbone be immune? Like, they should have done a Wishbone episode of The King in Yellow.
Oh my gosh.
11 out of 10. I would watch that on repeat.
He would have the ruffle too, for sure. Again.
I have a quick sidestep fact about
Wishbone?
Octopuses.
Oh.
Not Wishbone, sorry. It is to do with seeing. So, octopuses, they can camouflage themselves and like show amazing colors. They are colorblind. They've only got one type of, I think it's rods in there. I think that's what's been seen. So how do they see color? And there's a theory whereby if you look at an octopus's eye, they can actually move the muscles around it to do different things. So like sometimes you see them like as a U, or like almost like a dumbbell type thing, or a W. And apparently they believe it's because they're trying to change the way the light is entering to the eye and hitting certain things, and they're trying to differentiate the wavelengths. Just as you were talking about, that they see light, it just hits a different way, so they can differentiate the different wavelengths of light, and that's how they can see people seeing like, oh, that's an angry octopus, I'm going to go and hide, or something like that, or this is a mate, I'm going to try and do different colors. So that's my fact about octopuses, which relates to Call of Cthulhu. There, done.
That's wild.
Yes, and as we learned before, that octopuses have tentacles, ergo cosmic horror. As
Cosmic
looping it
horror.
right back.
Done.
I mean, that they might be, because there's a theory that that their genetic, like what the microorganisms that eventually evolved into like cephalopods, octopus, squid, is extraterrestrial.
There you go.
And I don't have a good segue to loop us back into queer horror, not to put the brakes on this. I have a feeling we'll make our
Tentacles
way.
are sexy in fiction.
There we
There.
go. Before we get much deeper into discussing RPG scenarios and how we can try to really emphasize and introduce a lot of these queer narratives to elevate this kind of horror, I was wondering, Hailey, if you had any recommendations just in terms of general media. Like you've mentioned Clive Barker as a potential inspiration, but other media that you may recommend for folks as trying to create. I need to really write these things down ahead of time.
I don't watch this movie, but the soundtrack I recommend for creativity is She Comes at Night, I believe it's called. I think that's what it's called. But yeah, I don't watch the movie, but definitely the score is, I'm sorry to say that.
This is a safe space here.
A safe space that is going to be, people listening to. I'm not sure with movies, because I honestly thought I had one and then it just dropped out of my head and I cannot remember what it was. Books wise, I would say people should be keeping an eye out for Spread Me by Sarah Gailey, that's coming out in September.
Ooh.
Which is essentially The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, as erotic queer horror.
I'm so excited.
I've read it. And
Ooh,
it is.
I did not know about this. I love Just Like Home, so I'm excited.
Yeah.
I wish I could remember what the hell movie I was thinking of, and I just can't.
If you just say it randomly later, Lex will edit it back in.
Sure.
Shrek. Oh,
Very good. Yeah.
No, listen.
It's got a great soundtrack. I don't know what you guys are talking about.
Lex, obviously it's Shrek 2.
I was trying to be
Yeah.
good. I put it in the document and Holly said no. So
Yeah.
Well, okay, Beth, Holly, Fiona, any other recommendations for queer movies, shows, books to try and keep an eye out for sources of inspiration?
I mean, admittedly, I've only seen these particular episodes I was going to mention from Black Mirror once, and I'm absolutely going to pronounce them wrong because I've never had to pronounce them out loud at all. Because one is Striking Vipers, where it's two male friends fighting in like VR, like a fighting game, but they don't recognize each other, and then they get addicted to fighting each other, and then a relationship sort of blooms. And then the opposite of that, which is San Junipero, thank you, where again it is this sort of a queer relationship happening in this virtual space. And the reveal, I am going to spoil it, is that these two people who are using these avatars, they're actually very elderly and they are close to passing away. Again, another thing we don't really discuss with queer horror is the age. Often queer folks are usually very young, and we don't necessarily explore older relationships or older queer folks who have maybe been around a long time and maybe seen lots of different horror stuff. But those are the two that sort of came off the top of my head, just thinking about it.
With that, I mean, there's reasons for that. They're not great ones, unfortunately. But
Sadly,
I would,
yeah.
on that, I would say to check out the Gilda stories and Red X. Those are both ones where it's older characters and by older authors too.
I'm going to put Chuck Tingle into the conversation. I feel like
Heck yeah.
if anybody knows queer writing, it's maybe Chuck Tingle. Maybe that's just the circles I run in. But I loved Camp Damascus. I thought it was really good. And his newer one, that the name I can't remember.
Lucky
Bury your
Day.
gaze. Oh,
Oh, sorry.
is there
Bury
another
Your
one?
Gaze. Bury Your Gaze. Was the one I
Haley's
was
ahead of
thinking
me.
of.
That must be a new,
Yeah, I'm
new
sorry.
one.
That's August.
Oh my goodness. That wasn't, I didn't actually see that. I don't know if he's posted about it a lot.
Oh yeah, Lucky Day comes out the same day as A Game in Yellow, August 12th.
Oh, nice. Okay,
Oh.
great.
I
Amazing.
love explaining Chuck Tingle to people.
I've Chuck Tingle
Yeah.
so much.
I'm like, let me just show you the book covers presented without comment. And
Speaking of romance and horror, like perfect.
thinking back earlier, it's a little queer. It's not maybe explicitly queer. And circling back to the girlhood is horror, I have a lot of love for Jennifer's Body.
I've never met her. Sorry.
I'm
sorry.
Hey.
Incredible.
Thank you.
She didn't say Shrek. It wasn't Shrek, so
That's true.
Well, we were all thinking about it. It's the unsaid one.
yeah. Unfortunately, that's where my head is now. Each time Beth starts to talk, is just like, okay, when's
it gonna
Shrek
happen?
coming into
When's
it?
it going to come back to Shrek? Yeah.
I blame myself for mentioning the swamp by accident with Creature from the Black Lagoon when I meant to say rainforest.
Is it really a rainforest? I didn't know
It's
that.
true. It is your fault. I didn't mention Lord of the Rings earlier when you were talking about the book controlling people.
Oh, the One Ring is such a little piece of horror. And like, honestly, you
Yeah.
could drop something like that into any situation. It's going to make it so much worse.
That's my other recommendation is Lord of the Rings trilogy
Makes
extended
you-
editions.
And like, and if you read the books and you see from certain points of view,
Yeah.
you feel how much it makes you think it loves you. And that is
Mhm.
so horrible. And honestly, you could probably put that into a queer horror situation as well, because like someone who's queer, depending on their situation, depending on how much heteronormativity they face with, they really want to believe that.
Hmm.
Well, now that we are all primed on different media recommendations and things, I want to sort of pivot us into how we can take a lot of these discussions and themes we have touched on already and bring that into tabletop RPGs, both in terms of inspired editing for published scenarios and potentially writing our own stories or creating our own systems. Something that you mentioned way back in the beginning before too much Shrek talk, Haley, is that whenever we're talking about creating queer horror or making queer stories for these games, that sort of representation or incorporating queer characters into an existing plot kind of feels like the initial step, point of entry, as it can promote some visibility and, just having representation of queer folks within this broader scenario. Like, that's good. But I'm wondering if we have recommendations for some more dynamic ways to make queer characters or more queer narratives shine in these stories in ways that maybe we haven't seen in other scenarios so far, or how to improve them to bring in more of these types of narratives.
I mean, some of that is going to be about having kind of, if you're in a situation like the Aliens TTRPG that Fiona was mentioning, where you have like these pre-made characters, maybe you'd want to have them where they were explicitly queer, as opposed to just an option that you could bring to the situation. But the setting is also important, like the one you were mentioning with the 70s peninsula, with Cosmic Horror. Stuff like that, I think, is why we're starting to see more books that take place in like conversion camps, because unfortunately that does create an explicitly queer scenario. But it doesn't always have to be that. It can be a community thing. It can be a gay bar, for example, would make an interesting start to a situation. And that's the other thing. I meant to mention when we were talking about like in Call of Cthulhu situations, characters get a letter. They get told to come to a location. They encounter stuff there. Honestly, sometimes it's a matter of just having things intrude on the characters.
Yeah.
Don't let it be an invitation. Let it be like something you don't have a choice with, because that is what a lot of us deal with in real life. It's not like we want to be in a lot of the situations we're in. It's just, it's not like somebody sends a letter. It's like, hey, do you want to find out your family member's really homophobic? It's like, no, not really. It's just something that's thrust upon you. And this is within the realm of a horror situation. Another is like, take something like what Beth was talking about with Light Most Hateful or Your Mind is a Terrible Thing, where you do have this homogenous thing that's changing people. And that's kind of can be a body snatcher situation. Or it can be like, I can't remember the name of this JRPG. It was from like the early 2000s or late 90s. I never played it, which is probably why I can't remember the name of it, but somebody was talking about it way back. And essentially this entity wanted everybody to be good and nice. And so essentially anyone who was around it would pretty much lose their personality. Threats like that, unfortunately, is going to be where it is as far as like a horror situation that is going to be queer, I think, because if you're dealing with those themes, you're going to have to consider what that means from a queer scenario. But that's my perspective. When I'm developing a story, I'm usually not thinking about like, how will this symbolize this, like, oppression or something. It kind of is just flowing from what is going on between my concepts and what the character is personally dealing with. And a lot of it grows out of that. And I think it's just like my perspective and my worldview is what ends up informing those elements of it. Like I didn't really think about that connective tissue between The Light Most Hateful and Your Mind is a Terrible Thing until Beth said it. So clearly that's something I just did subconsciously and is something that is, a concern of mine. I don't know if any of that is helpful.
I definitely think so. And I think that, we're getting into like where you had recommended before, drop them in it. Like, don't wait for them to get a letter unless that letter is, do you want to go to therapy? No? Now the bad things are happening. But like thrusting the player characters from their normal lives that they don't really have a choice, but to try to deal with what's going on. And especially if what's going on is worsening over time, that it becomes something unignorable. I keep thinking on like with The Worm and His Kings and other things is not relying on a lot of exposition up front. Like in Call of Cthulhu scenarios, it's really common to like do research on a thing and whatnot going forward, but potentially using flashbacks or something to get some of that character growth while they're still invested in what's going on.
And that's where I think instead of exposition, you can have investigation. It's not necessarily preemptive research so much as trying to get to the bottom of the situation you've been thrust into. Not saying it has to be this way, but like take, for example, Saw. Like that's not cosmic horror, but it is a situation where like the characters wake up and they're chained up in a bathroom. They have no idea what's going on. You have no idea what's going on. You find out as the story progresses. And it doesn't have to be as constricted as that, but it can be a situation where if you want answers, you're going to have to find them and you're going to have to find them within the situation you've been placed in. A Light Most Hateful is like that too. There's nobody coming at the beginning of A Light Most Hateful like, so here's what's going on and now you need to escape. You realize you have to escape because this woman suddenly just unfurled into this big snake monster and swallowed a high school football player whole. And now you have to get out of there, but you don't know why she's happening. You don't know why she's there. You don't know what the hell she is. And then just it gets worse from there. And I think that's another important thing to do to players is to like make it get worse.
I'm on her side, honestly.
Like it's just it's the only way out is through. Mm-hmm. And then maybe I think the players have to have that be the situation for them as well.
And I think something that you touched on earlier is while the only way out is through, that the player or the character growth and development can be a really, really prominent theme or I don't know literary terms, but like thing that happens as you need to try and adapt in some way and potentially confront things about yourself in order to try and deal with what's going on.
Yeah, and that comes down to breaking down certain types of plots. You have plots that exist, period, and the characters are just kind of pieces of that plot. You have character-focused plots, and you have character-driven plots. And I think sometimes it's important to figure out which one you're doing, and maybe that might be something that players have to kind of form with the DM.
I was going to go back to the question about incorporating or honoring players who are creating queer characters or creating characters with queer backgrounds. The one thing that came to mind for me was just incorporating other players' backgrounds or talking to other players. I think that was touched on with pre-gens, just making the pre-gens gay.
Why not? I mean, the thing is, like, the assumption already is that they're straight.
Yeah, pretty much. I had that assumption, and then the players told me that I was wrong. So I was like, yeah, that works for me.
I think if you're, especially in like convention settings, you know, when you're playing with strangers, like giving them that permission to be whatever they want to be. Permission sounds weird, but you know, just saying like, hey, I know we're playing in the 1920s, but you can be gay, you can have a wife, a husband, you can be queer, you can be whatever you want to be, and that we're not gonna threaten that because the narrative is like the 1920s, right? Like just saying, getting it out there and saying like, this is a possibility. You can, you know, I'm open to this.
Like I cannot tell you the amount of joy I had at a convention where I ran Brindlewood Bay, which is imagine Murder She Wrote, but also hooray, Murder She Wrote, but also some eldritch beings on it. And let me tell you, it's hard to run it at a convention anyway because you don't necessarily have time to do horror stuff. It's more murder mystery. But when often I have a table of usually pale, male, and stale individuals. Giving them the pitch. They might have just signed up to the game because they had no idea what it was. And I go, okay, you are playing elderly women who are part of a book club that solve murders. The delight of being given the permission to play older ladies, sensitively, obviously, but they just go, because before they'd be like, oh yeah, we'll be, maybe something heroic or handsome perhaps, but then being able to play something different. And I going back to that idea of playing someone maybe older perhaps, which again, in all sort of fantasy, whenever you think of D&D, everyone's always like 20-something-year-old heroes. I'm like, God, it was honestly such a joy for them then to be weirdly competitive about who was the best elderly woman trying to solve a crime, but they enjoyed it, and it's giving them that permission to be creatively free of something that they maybe haven't considered before was just
and that's a perfect example of what I mean with the pre-gens, just, you know, being queer from the get-go.
Sort of echoing what I'm hearing from a lot of this too is really giving your players the opportunity and enabling them to role play as these characters. As in a lot of games that I have played in, that, you know, sometimes it is the player characters are kind of just reacting to what's going on. There are events that are happening in the scenario, and then, you know, the players are just kind of figuring it out, doing whatever, but it doesn't have that personal connection. And so if you're writing in pre-gens in a scenario that have queer pre-gens, giving them reason and opportunity to role play out specific issues or with each other to really embody a lot of these conversations and these feelings at the table, I think is really meaningful. Like pretty much every character that I make in these games is gay, but they're not, like, it doesn't really do much. It doesn't seem to matter in terms of the overall plot. And so potentially finding opportunities as a GM to help make those more apparent and make them meaningful for the players and everyone involved.
You kind of made me think about it. I'm going to point to a Grant Howitt game. God love Grant Howitt. Big Gay Orcs, in which you play a big gay orc, and it's like the night before the big battle. Like, you don't know if you're going to make it. Nobody knows if they're going to live. This could be the end of everything. The big battle is here. But it gives you space to like explore those feelings with other people at the table. Like, I haven't played it myself, but I think it's about like spilling those feelings. Like, somebody here is somebody that you love, and you just never explored that as an opportunity. And, you know, I think it can, you know, especially with a Grant Howitt game, it has a high potential to be a little silly, but I think it also has the potential to be like bittersweet. You know, if you think about, we don't know if we're going to live tomorrow. Your example, Fiona, earlier of like, I don't know if I'm going to be here tomorrow. I need to tell you this now, you know, there's room for that. I think that's nice.
And I think having that type of pre-gen, because you were saying earlier about how like a lot of players will kind of make the same character, like the same personality a bunch of times, can help maybe encourage them to try other things, you know, break the mold like a shooting star.
So while we're here, do folks want to talk about any other really queer-focused tabletop RPG systems that people can check out if they're interested?
So I'll go very quickly because I will say this with the sort of label of like, I haven't played them. I've read a little bit of them. So obviously the quality of experience may vary depending on who you're playing with and all that sort of thing. But the ones that come to my mind easily are Thirsty Sword Lesbians, Girl by Moonlight, and Apocalypse Keys as well. All very different versions of like stories that you can tell on the sort of LGBT spectrum, all produced by Evil Hat, which I absolutely love. I think Evil Hat's one of the best publishing companies out there for TTRPGs, not just for like putting out queer content, but they're also accessible and supportive and stuff. So I just wanted to highlight those ones in particular. They have different sort of little genres. So like the Thirsty Sword Lesbians, who's in the title. Girl by Moonlight is that idea of like, in my head, the Sailor Moon or Cardcaptor Sakura, a femme presenting person turning into a magical girl. And Apocalypse Keys, again, the clue's kind of in the title with these keys that can, preventing the apocalypse in some way and dealing with evil forces, but in a very beautiful way. Like, again, the artwork, all three of these TTRPGs that I am speaking about have some incredible art as well. So, and I'd say what Evil Hat does really well, if you go to their website to buy their books, obviously, not sponsored by them, they have some really cool breakdowns of not only like why you should buy this book in terms of like the selling sheet, but also how to play videos and also actual play videos as well, which is very rare to find that a publisher will actually like, say, here, you're looking for queer content? We've got all the queer content about this book. Sometimes it gets hidden away depending on what company you're looking at. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight those three from Evil Hat and just support Evil Hat in general.
I'll shout out pretty much everything that J Dragon creates. I don't know if they like own Possum Creek Games or if they just work in conjunction with Possum Creek Games, but all those games are, if they're not centering queer stories, then it invites queer stories just by the way it's written,
100%.
Yeah. I think, I don't know who wrote it in our notes, but someone mentioned that they encourage they them pronouns, all different kinds and Sleepaway is one of J Dragon's newer works, and it's your teenage counselors at a summer camp, and you're trying to prevent your campers or protect them from this monster called the Lindworm that takes on the form of its victims. And the counselors were campers in the past, so you're kind of exploring themes of trauma. It's very, very queer focused. And the players are encouraged to actually create their own genders. It's not even just, the binary or the non-binary, but like all the other included too. And I think that's really awesome. But yeah, anything that J Dragon does is really intentional with queer representation or outright centering queer stories.
To follow on from that as well, of the Usaber's Bed and Breakfast as well, a whole bunch of incredible characters in there. And definitely, again, not to spoil it per se, but there are definitely characters who go on definitely gender expression and discovery arcs that you can choose as players. And what's cool about Usaber's is that you're not necessarily locked to one particular character. Again, very West Marches in a way that you can come into the hotel and here's this chapter and you can play a different person and see what those choices and then change the choices. So, because I just love that idea that multiple people can play the same character and have an impact and have a beautiful story that you'll share together. So yeah, absolutely. Usaber's is another one on top of that I would absolutely recommend from J Dragon and Possum Creek Games.
I was going to mention Monster Hearts. And related, Here There Be Monsters. I know you were going to mention that as well, Lex, but
Go for it.
Yeah, Here There Be Monsters and Monster Hearts. I think maybe that's a theme. Be labeled the monster lover, but you can create your own monsters, and it does explore explicitly a lot of LGBTQIA plus themes. As we mentioned, monsters are often coded as queer.
Again, sorry, I keep coming back on this because obviously I'm like, this is my area of specialty. Another game that came out late last year is Paint the Town Red, which is by Soul Muppet Publishing. They've done stuff like Orbital Blues, which is sad space cowboys, Inevitable, which is sad Arthurian cowboys, and then it's like Paint the Town Red, sad, often gay vampires. And what I want to mention for that is that it is queer coded regardless, but like when you read it, it is a very different flavor, I think, compared to some of the other ones we just talked about, which again are showing the positive, maybe like acceptance stuff. Whereas here it's angry, it's sad, there's definitely lots of content warnings about depression and mental health and all that sort of thing, but the anger that can come from it, and it's very, again, all Soul Muppet games have a very unique strand of looking at stuff like Mad as Hell, the sort of anti-capitalist demon hunting game they've got currently funded or just funded. Again, it's that sort of like, not righteous anger, but like that sort of anger of like, we need to do something. And I think it's just, when you read it through, the voice of the person writing it, this anger of like stuff, I just felt it was such a different take on possibly queer stories that we don't get to see. We just, maybe we have the sadness and we have the sort of positive, but never the anger that we all feel when bad things happen. So yeah, I just wanted to shout that out. Maybe it's something a little bit different. Obviously, I know like Vampire the Masquerade is like super sexy vampires, but may also be sad. But here it's like sad, probably angry and gay vampires in Paint the Town Red.
I feel like you can maybe also be sexy and Paint the Town Red, just really getting all of the notes there.
It's very more like emo than maybe goth. I think that's a little difference, I would say. But again, I've not played it.
Implying emos can't be sexy?
Look, I'm just saying I was a goth, and frankly, emos were just opposers in my books. But that's
solidarity.
For a different
Podcast, yes,
making enemies.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Emos catching strays.
Have you played Mall Goths versus Visigoths? I've heard it's very gay, but I've not played it.
It looks super fun. I haven't gotten a chance to play it yet.
Yeah. One that is deliberately horror, I would say. And I think it's interesting because, again, most solo games are technically horror games, but dealing with questions of identity and stuff is Horse Girl. And the premise is essentially is that you are a girl who dreams of becoming a horse, and you meet someone who agrees to do this transformation with you. And it's, again, it's pulling blocks out of towers, Wretched and Alone, if anyone's played that system, and prompts and stuff like that. And of course, it's sort of like, again, that sort of body horror, a little bit of substance in there, that sort of film. And it's like balancing up whether or not this is what you truly want to be. And I think it's so interesting when we're thinking, obviously, like trans identities now, because there's so much discussion right now about like, are we forcing people to change their identities? All this sort of propaganda, I would say. But, I think dealing those questions of like, you're not sure what you want to be. And it's done, I will say, incredibly graphically. So please be careful if you're playing the game. But it is almost like a performance sort of thing. So like you'll take a card and it will say, your fingers are cut off and hooves are put on, nailed on. And then you would draw a line around your fingers to symbolize that. So again, making those sort of very ritualistic, almost like a performance act for yourself to go through that sort of thing. It was just a very interesting reading experience. Again, I would say I have not played it myself, but I would recommend people to check it out. It's definitely one of the more unusual horror games that I've played. And I thought it was just a really, really scary, I'd say, but really interesting concept. So Horse Girl.
I'm still reeling. That was kind of fucked up there for a second.
Damn.
It is incredible. Let me tell you, it is incredibly fucked up.
You had me.
You
had me at Horse Girl, and then you lost me.
Somehow you lost her there.
Part of my brand is horses, and I feel like.
Oh, Beth, you might not be a horse girl at the end of that PDF. I'll be honest.
I'll give a shout out to Alice is Missing. One of the character options is to be the girlfriend of the missing girl, which can drive a narrative about, queer horror, queer persecution, maybe like religious themes within family and why a teenage girl might be missing. And honestly, every time we've played, we at this point, it's kind of a joke between me and Lex and Beth that it always, for whatever reason,
drugs?
Our stories always center around drugs, and I'm like, this could very easily be centered around just being queer.
Well, I was going to say the conversion camp idea kind of came to mind when
I would really actually like to explore that. The next time I play Alice is Missing. A game I have not played but is sitting on my shelf ready to be played is the game Women Are Werewolves, in which you play non-binary characters in a family where all women are werewolves, and it kind of explores that, gender spaces and queer versus not, non-queer and things like that. So, and it's a tarot deck, which I think is really interesting.
Heck yeah.
And I'm sure Beth would like to recommend the Shrek tabletop RPG for an undoubtedly queer role-playing experience.
Coming out soon, 2026.
Here we go. Find it on AO3.
The solo journaling experience of writing a Shrek fanfic.
Oh.
We hope these insidious whispers are helpful in addressing this topic at your table. Be sure to check out the show notes for links for things that we discussed in this episode, as well as an invite to our lab's Discord server to discuss more reanimations and consultations. We also post these episodes and resources to our Patreon that's free to follow, or if you like, you can make a charitable donation to help us keep the ominously flickering lights on at the H. West Memorial Mortuary and Laboratories. Hailey, where can folks find you online if they want to read your books or find you on social media?
My books are at all the usual places, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop, different indie stores. I'm at haileypiper.com. I try to keep it updated with all the new stuff that's going on. And on social media, I'm Hailey Piper Fights on Instagram and Blue Sky.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming by, and happy Pride as we're recording this on June 1st. And I'm hopefully going to get this out at the end of the month.
Thank you so much for having me. This was delightful.
It's been wonderful having you here. And also, Beth and Fiona, thank you both for guest appearing for this interview episode. Do y'all have any shout outs you want to deliver there?
Just listen to David Behavior. We do have an upcoming episode that is relevant to this.
Is it about Shrek?
Yeah, it's about we read Shrek fan fiction, and that's going to be an upcoming episode. And now we have to do it.
Yeah,
because I said it.
It is now canon. Wow.
Holly, you have to come onto the episode to
only if we
that
find whatever the My Immortal equivalent of
No.
the Shrek fan.
No.
Perfect.
And then I will read it out loud on
That's
your
the
podcast.
Out
okay,
loud.
great, perfect.
You play all the characters.
That's the only time you'll come onto our podcast. Perfect. Sounds good.
I'll advertise everything else that I do, which is you can find me on What Am I Rolling, which is a twice monthly tabletop RPG one-shot podcast where we do lots of different RPG systems and interviews with game designers. If you're like, I want to go back to the heteronormative of D&D, fine.
But why are you listening at this point, honestly?
You should have already cut off at this point, but I also do the DM's Book Club, which is a weekly book club podcast where we talk about different topics in D&D and how we can improve it and include it in any kind of story. And then the final thing I will plug is I'm 1/3 of the RP Geeks, which is a nerdy TTRPG show that happens most Tuesdays over on YouTube. We enjoy running different RPGs, and then during a session, when we go to a break, we're like, here's a lore drop on something that's come up in the session. That's where my octopus fact came from. So that's What Am I Rolling, the DM's Book Club, and the RP Geeks, wherever you find TTRPG shows or podcasts. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us.
And so until next time.
Thanks for listening to RPG Reanimators,
Where your games can die
Or live.
On the table. You gotta put on this glazed stare like I try to have.
Yeah, the screensaver mode. That's what I call it.
Elevator music behind the eyes.
I thought I could see like the pipe screensavers just in the glasses for a bit.